I've been thinking a lot. You know what's wild, right? Like, I want to have these random videos on like the next podcast, but I also want to make them specific to the podcast. Like, what am I doing now that is putting me in a position where I will be able to realize the goal that I have for Mact the podcast? What am I doing now that will ensure that my vision for Mackenzie Hive is realized? And sometimes we put a lot on ourselves. So yeah, there's clearly gang son over here, but doesn't matter. And I've been thinking a lot. You know what's wild, right? Like, I want to have these random videos on like the next podcast, but I also want to make them specific to the podcast. But thing is, how will I know when I haven't even recorded anything yet, right? And also, like, you saw like the one, I think it had nothing to do with the podcast, but like there were some moments where people were speaking and like it seemed like they were saying what I was saying in the podcast. So I don't know, I suppose I'm just trying to recreate that and see how that goes. Okay. Greetings to you all and welcome to Mact the podcast. I'm your host Marlise McKenzie, and as always, it's a pleasure to be here. I look forward to every episode that I do, and yeah, today is one of those where I think that we are finally at the point where we perhaps need to check in with ourselves. Um and it's gonna seem like I am a bit all over the place. It's gonna be one of those episodes again. Yes, it's been a while since we had those. And I figured that maybe right now it's the time. We've been talking about virtual inclusivity. We've been talking about not being dismayed in the fact of death, but rather rejoicing in the fact of death. And I think it is important to embrace changes in our lives. Reason I say it's important to embrace changes in our lives is looking back at the beginning of the year. You had these plans that you wanted to put in motion. You have probably achieved most of them, or you've only really just achieved half of them or a quarter of them, whatever the amount of plans you've achieved. Point is, you have achieved those plans, and some of them you have not. Maybe you have achieved the greater goals that you had set out for the year. Maybe you have achieved lesser goals that you had planned for the year. And what I mean is basically just the value of these goals. Maybe your biggest plan this year was to purchase a car. Maybe your least greatest goal this year was to just quit a habit. The point here is all those changes are actually quite big changes, and all those changes add value to your life. And I think that it is important that we embrace them. But oftentimes things get in the way of us embracing these changes because we look onto the things that we have not achieved. We look onto the things that we have not achieved, and that kind of takes away from the achievement of everything else we have accomplished throughout the year. And while that may be the case, once in a while, it's important to have, I suppose, look back to what you did and have a whole list of everything that you have achieved, all those that you can probably transfer into the next year, and those that you still want to accomplish before the end of the year. I think that it's important that we do that because, like I said, we tend to look at the things we did not achieve and we give ourselves a hard time about it and end up feeling like a failure. Whereas, like, you literally have all these things that you have done. But the fact that you haven't done all the other three things that you wanted to do, and mid-year, or rather end-year fatigue is setting in, you kind of feel like everything is worthless. So yeah, personally, I have a couple of things that I wanted to do. One of them was um create new art, and I have not created new art. Yes, I have been writing. Yes, I have been kind of like drawing, trying to improve my drawing, but like I haven't necessarily given it much thought like that, or much intent, and put in a lot of effort towards that, because clearly it's not a priority for me. And it gets tough when you actually have to have these conversations with yourself and realize that, okay, I don't think I'm being intentional about this. Sure, this is something that I want for myself. This is something that I want to do. But question is, do I want to do this now? Do I see the value of doing it now? And the answer may be yes, I see the value of doing this now, and yes, I want to do this now. But what are all the other things that are disturbing me from actually achieving this thing that I so badly want to do right now, that I so badly want for myself right now? What's the reason that I cannot do this? What is getting in my way? And that's when you get to realize that, like, we sometimes put ourselves in these positions, like, we don't necessarily cater for the now. We don't cater for the next 2 months. We don't cater for the next 3 months. And that way, when things come, when things happen, they end up taking most of our time that we now put on all these other things on hold. I had a meeting with someone I consider a mentor, I suppose. I consider them a mentor, even though like we haven't like established a formal thing like that, that like, okay, you're definitely my mentor, like that. But and I was having this conversation with him where I explained that I realized that, like, one of my faults, I suppose, is that I'm able to think about all these things that I want to do and all these things that I'm doing, and I have a plan for all of them, written or not written. But I more so have the goal, the end goal. I have it figured out, but I don't have the next 3 months figured out. I don't have the next 2 months figured out. I don't have the now. But while I'm doing this, I know how I'm going to get there. But you can't necessarily confidently say that you know how you're going to get there when you realize that you don't know what you'll be doing in the next 2 months. You have an idea, but the point is, how are you going to do that? And I think that part of embracing these changes is accepting that and being honest with yourself like that, that okay, I don't know what I'm doing right now. I don't know what I'm doing in the next 2 months, but I definitely know that in the next 5 years, that is what I'm going to be doing. That I'll be there. And it puts you in a position where you now have to start strategizing. You now have to start asking yourself these questions, like, what am I doing now that is putting me in a position where I will be able to realize the goal that I have for Mact the podcast? What am I doing now that will ensure that my vision for Mackenzie Hive is realized? And sometimes we put a lot on ourselves. And I mean this in terms of age, that I know that like most of the people who listen to my podcast are people who are around about 18, 19 to 25. And these are the years of our lives where we're literally so young, but we're yet so old, because you realize that your future is in your hands, and it is so hard. It is so hard because you literally just arrived, and You have to start figuring it out. And yes, you will have your parents tell you that, hey, breathe, you're a kid. But next thing you know, they're telling you about all these responsibilities that you have, all these things you should be doing and should not be doing at your age. So I really hope that we position ourselves in such a manner that we have more conversations with ourselves, that we do not look externally for validation, that we do not look externally for ideas and encouragement and nourishment. But don't get me wrong, I'm not saying completely divorce yourself off of that. But I think once you have all these inspirations, all these values, all these interactions that you've had with people in your line of business, people whom you look up to, people whose opinions matter to you, who people whom you value greatly, right? Um I think that it becomes important that after you have considered all of that, taken it all in, ask yourself the same questions they asked you and repeat that to yourself so that you have a clearer vision for yourself, so that you know what it is that you want to do. And honestly, as I'm saying this to you, I am taking cognizance of what I'm saying because these are conversations that I'm having with myself. And I think it's time for me to actually start having these conversations regularly with myself, pin them down, talk about these things, go out and interact with people on these things, basically implement these ideas. And this is when you realize the part that I said, don't completely divorce yourself off of external gratification. Don't divorce yourself completely off of external validation, external encouragement, external conversation, external advice. Do not divorce yourself completely off of community. Find the self in community. And this is essentially part of what Matt the podcast is trying to do, is trying to realize in every conversation and contribute to society holistically. And that society, of course, in this case, being the audience of this podcast, the people who have been with me since day one, the people who continue to come back and engage with my content. Because on days that I feel dismayed, on days that I feel discouraged, I know that there's three people who want to hear what I have to say, three people who will be encouraged by what it is that I have to say, three people who greatly look forward to the content that I produce and want to engage with it and interact with it. And whenever I feel that, okay, there's a lot of changes happening in my life. There's a lot of changes happening in Mac the podcast. There's a lot of changes in my brain chemistry, whatever that means. I just have to remember that while I am embracing these changes, do not forget the people who contribute to that change. Do not forget the people who contribute to the value of your life, to the value of your content creation. And I think that is finding the self in community. And this is a podcast on its own, finding the self in community. But basically, all these things, all these questions that we may have, is what enables us to find the self in community. Ladies and gentlemen, and others, I am your host, Mardise McKenzie, and I hope you had a beautiful Heritage Day. I hope that you did great stuff. You did whatever people do on Heritage Day, and I would love to hear about it all in the comments. And if you have any suggestions for future podcasts, let me know. I'm thinking of doing a Q&A soon, and I'm also trying to like change my podcast style. I suppose you can see that. So Yeah, man. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much for your consistency. To all those who comment and all those who like, I appreciate you ever so greatly. And to everyone else who doesn't, please do subscribe, please do comment, please do like, and please do share my content. I'm sending you love and I'm sending you light. Mact the podcast.